Hi everybody! In this tutorial I will show you how I painted a simple and easy blue crocus flower. First I began with an outline drawing that I transferred to my watercolor paper. I've listed for you the 6 tube colors I'm using to paint with for this study. Next I mixed gold ochre with sap green in a watery mixture. I began with my first layer of color at the stem of the flower. It's important to note I did not pre-wet the surface. I began painting in my lightest tones first, making sure to keep the outside edges of the stem very clean. It should be noted that my environment may be warmer than yours, therefore the paper will dry extremely fast or slower in your environment. Keep that in mind and adjust accordingly. So I'm going to speed things up a bit to show you the first layer of the stem painted in. After the first layer has dried, I began painting in the second layer with a slightly darker pigment. Here's where I wanted to begin adding in some of the detail. In the side-by-side showing my reference photo, you can see the first layer is our lightest tone, where we'll begin to build layers for depth and dimension. Then I began painting in my next layer using the same mixture as previous. The next area I painted was under the petal, where I began by mixing King's Deep Blue, Winsor Newton Blue, and a watery consistency. The lightest tones are always the first to be painted, then I'll come back over the first layers with some midtones and then add my darkest tones for detail. Because these are relatively small areas, I paint them in as washes rather than wetting the surface first, making it much easier for beginners to learn how to control the amount of water needed. In this way, my focus is establishing my lightest tones first without worrying about the watercolor drying too fast, giving me more control over my watercolor. As you can see, I painted in this area with the blue mixture and feathered out the edges with a clean brush that I pulled all of the water out with my hand, then painted out the transition. Next, I mixed the bright violet with a touch of King's Blue and painted that layer just below my previous layer and then blended the edges where they meet. Then with the tip of my brush, I blended the bright violet mixture into the green layer and I transitioned it with no pigment and a slightly dampened brush. Keep in mind this is only our first layers to establish our lightest tones to the flower. After that layer has fully dried, I began to paint in darker tones. I continue to check my reference photo to guide me in my next layer, adding in some of my midtones. Using the tip of my brush and long strokes, I can buffer the transition easier. Once that layer dried, I mixed slightly thicker color of bright violet and a pinch of King's Blue, adjusting the light or darkness in the transition as needed. Next, I moved to the opposite side using King's Blue in a watery consistency. Then I added in the bright violet mixture right on top, using the tip of my brush and light strokes to make the transitions easier to control. At this point, my brush is a smaller detail brush that doesn't hold a lot of water, painting in somewhat dry format, then feathering out the color as I move down towards the stem of the flower. After that is dry, I began to add in some darker tones using my King's Blue, Winsor Newton Blue, and the bright violet mixture, adjusting the dark and lightness as I go using the reference photo as my guide. Adding a darker tone of the King's Blue mixture, I begin to create depth. While that is drying, I focused on the largest portion of the blue crocus. After that, I mixed King's Blue, a little bit of bright violet, and a touch of Winsor Newton Blue red in a watery consistency. This is to establish my lightest tones first. I used a number 8 sable brush that holds more water and painted in a light wash, careful to keep enough paint loaded on my brush as I work down towards the center of the flower. Keeping a slight tilt to your working surface allows gravity to move the paint towards the center of the flower. Then I took the tip of my brush with my 2 fingers and gently pulled out all the water, creating a flat point where I painted out long strokes, feathering to a very light tone towards the center of the flower. I will come back to this area and paint in a light yellow and gold ochre mixture later. I continue to paint the base of the flower with this light mixture to the rest of the flower. Again, using the tip of my brush with a darker tone of the blue mixture, I stroke the edges as I build up that turning edge to create a depth and dimension. One thing that should be noted is that pure sable brushes form very tight points at the tip, allowing you to paint very tight detail. These brushes are really nice to add to your arsenal of tools. So now that our paper is at a semi-matte stage, any of the details added, the paint will disperse at a very slow rate, keeping its form. I mixed a darker blue mixture and painted in the left petal, making sure to paint my edges very clean. While the petal is still wet, I added deeper blue colors to begin to define the edges. I continued with the same mixture, defining edges with the tip of my brush. Then I started working wet into wet and adding in some deeper tones to the petal on the left, building the turning edge of the petal, adding darker tones, allowing that to dry. I moved back to the right side of the flower using the same mixture of King's Deep Blue, Winsor Newton Blue Red, and bright violet. There are 3 stages of wet or dryness that I refer to, and those stages are shiny, semi-matte, and matte. If you look at an angle to the painted surface, you will notice these various stages, which are extremely important to learning how to control your watercolor. Next, I continued to paint in the remaining petal using my blue mixture, beginning with my lightest value, then painting in a darker turning edge to the petal. Once that was dry, I began painting the underside. Moving back to the center of the flower, I began to paint in long strokes of a slightly darker blue mixture, creating the lines of texture I see in my reference photo. Next, I paint in the 3 small stamens using a mixture of lemon yellow and gold ochre. After that, I moved back to the petal on the left using a darker blue mixture and began painting in another layer to darken my petal further. As I was drawing, I moved back over to the right petal using the tip of my brush to add in long textural lines I see in my reference photo. Using a drier mixture of bright violet and King's Deep Blue, I began painting in the details of the petal on the right. As you can see, once the flower is darkened and texture added with long strokes, the flower begins to take shape. I then painted in my darkest blues to my turning edges, working my way around the painting, adding additional details and veining as it begins to come alive. After that, I moved back to the center of the flower and painted a watery mixture of lemon yellow and gold ochre. I carefully painted around the stamens, making sure not to touch them. Once that dried, I noticed it needed a second layer of color because it was still too light. Notice I paint up to the blue petals but not beyond it, and here's the reason why. We have to understand what are our three colors. We have primary colors, we have secondary colors, and we have tertiary colors. Our focus will be on tertiary colors because my blue mixture with bright violet and my gold ochre is a warm color, so we'll consider that close to a yellow-orange, although it is not a true yellow and orange color mixed together. When the two are mixed or overlapping one another, they cancel each other out, losing hue, by producing a grayscale color, like black or white. In this instance, the goal is to maintain our individual colors that sit next to one another so they remain bright. Looking at my tones, I knew the stem was still too light and undefined, so I painted in another layer and defined the detail further. Now I move around the painting, adjusting and darkening where it is necessary for better definition. All the final details are painted in using a darker Winsor Newton blue red with bright violet. As you can see, once the flower is darkened and texture added with long strokes, the flower begins to take shape. I then painted in my darkest blues to my turning edges, working my way around the painting, adding additional details and veining as it begins to come alive. In the final stages of the Blue Crocus Flower, I moved around painting in the last of the details of the petals, checking values and darkening areas where necessary. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial of the Blue Crocus. These tutorials will be for all skill levels, so you can choose which tutorial best suits your skill level. Make sure to sign up to be notified when my online watercolor classes begin.
If you've enjoyed this tip video and would like to see more of my full-length step-by-step tutorials, please visit my website where you can sign up to be notified when my watercolor classes will be available. Thank you for watching, liking, and subscribing.